All right, let's start at tight end here because this is in July 2021. These are the two guys we had. Tight ends that we projected for 2023 back then, Cade Stover and G. Scott. And so here we are, Nathan. And Cade Stover staying at Ohio State is a pretty darn big deal, but I think we're all interested to see the progression of G. Scott at that position. And there's a part of me that almost thinks like, as we've talked about it, sort of like a Ruckert tight end versus a Farrell tight end. I don't know if I even think of them the same way. Yes, of course, but there's also other parts of it where on some level, I almost feel like they're different positions, right? And I do sometimes they use those different
wide inline
designations for the tight ends, but we're going to lump them together as one position. But in July 21, we said Stover and Scott, and is that where we are now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you could put Joe Royer in the mix as the backup too, I think, at tight end, but certainly Stover locked in at number one. I'm glad we saved this for the third segment because I look really smart after having all that other stuff wrong. So this will be like the people's closing image of me. It's like, oh, he really nailed that tight end projection. But even at that time, like we were almost thinking of Stover like, oh, maybe he'll turn into something by then. I don't think in July of 2021 I was thinking about Cade Stover, the guy who we thought might actually just leave and go to the NFL this summer because he had such a good 2022 and had really proved himself in his first year as a starter and became a huge part of this offense. And I'm very intrigued by him. We haven't heard for sure like where things stand with him right now health-wise, how soon he gets back on the field. They obviously don't need to push it with him this spring. He knows what he's doing, and physically, otherwise, beyond the back problems, the back spasms he had in the playoff game, he's there. So he can kind of ease into the spring and do as little as he needs to do to get through there. But there are ways his game needs to improve. And that's maybe what I'm most eager to see about him is he did some things very, very well. There were some other things he did blocking wise that I think he still needs to make another progression in. And so all the things he did as a receiver last year came in the package of someone who still has growth to make at that position. Even though someone like Ruckert talked throughout his career about how he was incrementally getting better, he was always on that tight end, that straight line through that position. And Stover bounced around a little bit. It wasn't as natural for him in the beginning. And I think he could still maybe make a jump this year. I think the injury complicates it a little bit, but assuming he can come back relatively quickly and get back to work, he might be even better this year. And I don't know if that might actually mean less receptions, depending on how the offense works out. It's hard to really bank on what a tight end's going to do in this offense. But his overall play, I think, could still really make a jump this year, and he could really push himself into just another level.
Even the moments, I can remember when I wrote about Cade Stover after the Penn State game, I think it was, and talking to Kevin Wilson, it was like, oh man, all this stuff he did. And he was like, yeah, well, in the first half, he missed 3 blocks. And it's like, he still had some moments. I think certain things like, right, there were a couple times when you got him outside and split him out, especially when he's blocking on bubble screens and some of the out in space stuff and getting a right angle on a block and making sure you're not reaching and holding guys. I think he wasn't as good at that when you lined him up at the run game and sort of like let him pound guys. Sometimes he really took care of business. And obviously what he did as a pass catcher, this is one of those positions where they're better off than they were a year ago. Because a year ago, we were like, do they have a tight end? Can they persuade Cade Stover that he's not a linebacker and make him a tight end? And now it's the same guy who's much more established. So I do think to see what G. Scott might do, we've been intrigued by that ever since he moved to tight end. 2023 is the time for him to show it, right? He's grown into it. He's worked into it. There's an opportunity there for them. But Cade Stover being back is obviously a big deal. I think we all get it. Let's move to receiver. Steven, Nathan, we were on it. July 2021, his 3 projected starters at receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr. and Julian Fleming on the outside and Emeka Egbuka in the slot. Here we are, Steven, and that's what it's going to be. And it is, I think you can lump Cade Stover into this, like the most meaningful pass catchers for this team are all back. And this is a pretty crazy group to think about. Marvin and Emeka have to be here, because this is their third year in college. Julian does not have to be here, but I think Julian Fleming still wants to show the best version of Julian Fleming. I'm particularly intrigued by that, Stephen, like what we might be expecting from year 4, if he can be 100% healthy all year, Julian Fleming. There's still maybe something there that we have not yet seen.
Yeah, I think when we were having that discussion in 21, it was, hey, is this dude going to pop and have like a Marshawn Lattimore thing in 2022 where he's just 1 year and now he's a first rounder? I mean, that would be the room to do it in wide receiver, given how they're doing, guys. That didn't happen. But unfortunately, we didn't get Jackson this past year. But fortunately, this trio got an extra year together. They got an extra 13 games, basically, well, 11 because Julian Fleming missed 2 weeks. But they got extra time together, and now they're going to lean on them because it's a new starting quarterback. Julian's interesting because we've now seen the two sides of when they've got real dudes at all 3 receiver spots to different levels, obviously. We've seen the offense where all 3 of them are basically 1,000-yard receivers because they don't throw to the tight end at all. Like Chris Olave would have had it had he played in the bowl game, obviously. But we've also seen the offense where the tight end is involved, and because of that, it takes away from whoever wide receiver 3 is. In this situation, Julian Fleming was wide receiver 3. So to the point with Cade Stover, does Cade Stover have the same level of production next year? And so because of that, Julian Fleming only has like 35 catches for 400 yards or 350 yards, and that's a good year because it also meant the tight end was involved. Meanwhile, Marvin and Emeka are just the 1,000-yard guys we know them to be. Or do we see similar to what 21 was, where a fully healthy Julian Fleming, knowing what his role is, having experience, and so now it's like Marvin's got 1,400, Emeka's got 1,200, and Julian's got like 850.
So I think this maybe is an exercise that even if we aren't projecting Ohio State to have the greatest team in college football history, that we should do every summer, which is like project the team 3 seasons out. So we did this in 21. We had not yet seen the 21 or 22 seasons. We were talking about 2023. Maybe this summer we have not yet seen the 23 and 24 seasons, and we project out to 2025. Nathan, when something like this happens, where you're 3 for 3, is this Nathan Baird, prognosticator, soothsayer, knower of all things, or is this Brian Hartline keeps it tight? And it's like we stack them, we play them, we keep the conveyor belt moving when it's like, oh, yeah, no, Marvin, Emeka, Julian, here we go. You know, July 2021, you were exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, despite how obviously brilliant and insightful I am, this really is one of those positions where it's just plan A's. Like all these guys are plan A. Like all the top receiver recruit in the country for their class or highly ranked, and they're starting. Like that's the way it's supposed to happen. Like I was thinking about this kind of as we were having that offensive line conversations. Like, could you imagine how devastating it would be at Ohio State right now, or how we'd be talking about it if like the receiver recruiting looked like the offensive line recruiting? But even then, it wouldn't be as much of a catastrophe because even if you just hit on 2 guys, at least you've still got like 2. You know, the Donovan Jackson and the Matt Jones of receivers, and you'd be figuring out a third thing, you'd still be better off than having to come up with 3 starters on the offensive line from and again at receiver, the depth is there. Like there's some really intriguing. I went ahead and put who did I put? Like Xavier Johnson and Jaden Ballard and Caleb Brown, I think is the 3 backups right now at the receiver spots. But Xavier Johnson's more like a catch all, like everything. He's going to be everything. And I mean, there's some guys like that. Last year's freshman class didn't do a whole lot, but didn't really have an opportunity, which is kind of how it works at Ohio State now. You've always got first-round draft picks at receiver lined up as your starters, so how much those other guys really get to break through as freshmen, and that's going to kind of be true again this year. So there's some interesting underbelly – that's not the word I'm looking for. There's some interesting lower depth chart stuff that could happen at receiver this year. Like who steps up either from this new true freshman group that's coming in. Some of the best candidates for that maybe don't get here till the summer, I suppose. But does somebody show some real growth since last year? But as far as those first 3, yeah, no, that's not me. Those guys were supposed to be great, and we could easily project that they were going to be great, and that's who would be here in the 3rd year, and it's worked out exactly according to plan. That's the difference between receiver and offensive line, and that's why the receivers coach keeps getting promoted and the offensive line coach isn't here anymore.
Steven, week seven. Ohio State, I don't even know who to play. Ohio State has a big lead. Late in the third quarter, they put in the second team offense in week 7.
Mm-hmm.
So they're putting in their 3 backup receivers. What do you think the chances are that Brandon Inniss takes the field in that group?
High. And to be honest with you, of the 3, I'll mark it down. Ooh, we're recording this on a Monday too. I will mark this down that when they're playing that team that they know they're going to beat by 80, and so there's going to be an opportunity for the freshmen to play. I would bank that when you see those guys at the bottom of the depth chart, it'd be 2 freshmen and 1 of the sophomores. And because it's in the true nature of mark it down Monday fashion, I will say Noah Rogers at X. I think he's really intriguing. I think Brian Hartline's had a type. I even told him that last summer, and he was like, well, what's my type? And then I told him Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. And then Marvin Harrison. I think his type is changing, whether it's because of Marvin Harrison. I think Noah Rogers, you got Jeremiah Smith in the 24 class, these bigger kind of freakish X receivers. So I think he's a really intriguing prospect. I think he'll be at X. I think Inniss will be at slot H. And I'll say I'll put Caleb Brown at Z. But I can hear a case for Kojo just because both of those guys came in last summer and very quickly seemed to pass up the guys who were here in the spring.
Those guys would be passing up Ballard.
So this is one of these things, Nathan, like
I don't think he would. I think Ballard's might sprinkle in there a little bit with the ones next year just because he's year 3. I also don't think – I'm saying more like this is like 6 minutes left in the fourth quarter.
You're saying deep guys.
I don't think Ballard's – yeah, I think at that point Ballard's to it. Like he's your 5th best receiver next year. I don't think he's too high up on the depth chart to be out there with 6 minutes left in the game. You're up by 70.
Ballard's almost like maybe a slash, not quite a slash with Julian Fleming, but like a lowercase or.
Yeah. Like if Fleming got hurt and they had a full week to prepare, I wouldn't be shocked if Ballard was the starting Z the following week, even with Xavier Johnson.
We're like having this interesting conversation of like, ooh, this interesting conversation with the backup receivers, Nathan. And then it's like, oh, that's the conversation we're having with the starters on offensive line. This is the whole thing, right? That's the thing we're talking about. Like, oh, well, that could be intriguing. What if the freshmen play? Well, they have some sophomores. Well, where does the 3rd year, 4th year guy fit in? It's like, that should be a backup conversation. So we'll leave the receivers there. You guys know that Marvin Harrison Jr., Mecca Booker, and Julian Fleming are going to do their thing in 2023, which will lead us to running back to finish this up. And in July 2021, Nathan, and talking about this, we had treveyon-Henderson as the guy and Evan Pryor behind him. Both expect, third, this was 2023. They'll be 3rd-year players in 2023. And then Mayan Williams entered the conversation. I was like, yeah, but that guy was an Iowa State commit. I was like dismissive of Mayan Williams as I was until Mayan Williams made sure I wasn't dismissive of, ran me over and put his shoulder right in my sternum and knocked me backwards and made me make sure that I don't do that anymore. But that's the conversation we had then, Nathan. Henderson, Pryor, Williams, and here we are. And those 3 guys are still here along with 9 other running backs. So how did you do this with the depth chart you did right now in this world? What'd you do at running back?
So Henderson and Williams obviously are at the top. I think they've earned that. And there was a version of this that I did where I almost like anded them, even though I think Henderson is going to be the starter. I think it is more of you almost call it a 2-back system. I think, they've both done enough at this level that they've sort of earned that respect. It's on Henderson, I think, still to prove that he, to with his play, demand a greater share of those carries, and that could happen. But I ended up just doing a more conventional treveyon-Henderson starter, Mayan Williams backup. It gets crowded behind that though very quickly. With Pryor was doing some things last year before he got hurt. Hayden, I thought asserted himself well when he got that late season opportunities. Was the guy that they turned to in the playoff and did all right there for a true freshman. Chip Trayanum is now in that mix, and he was the guy that they turned to against Michigan. And we haven't heard for sure whether he's going to be a running back full time, I think, or could still end up at linebacker. But they need the depth at running back, I would argue, more than he needed at linebacker with only 2 spots there and several other interesting bodies. So they're pretty deep at running back right now, and it's another position where there's got to be a battle for like depth chart hierarchy there this spring. It reminds me a little bit of what we were talking about a couple years ago when they were going like 6 deep there and ended up having some injuries that helped determine where that room was going. Well, and also Steel Chambers became a linebacker. So we'll see. But it's those 2 guys have to be at the top. And I think Ohio State's in strong position with those guys if they're healthy. But that was obviously a big question mark that never really got just stayed a question mark through the whole second half of last year.
So I do think the or here is the most interesting part of this, because there was a time, I know, here's the thing. I was like, we've talked about this on this podcast. We talk about everything on this podcast. It's like one time we talked about mashed potatoes versus French fries. So we certainly had conversations about TreveYon-Henderson, Heisman candidate. And I don't think I'm going to have those conversations anymore. So there are, these websites that send out the super early Heisman odds. And TreveYon-Henderson, they sent it out in mid-January, was on there at 50-1. Devin Brown was 66-1. Arch Manning, 75-1. Donovan Edwards at Michigan, 80-1. So I just think that or will be big enough that right now, Stephen, I don't know that I'm thinking of TreveYon-Henderson as the starting running back for Ohio State in 2023. I think maybe I'm thinking of TreveYon-Henderson and Mayan Williams as the co-starting running backs in 2023. Maybe TreveYon actually starts, but I just think it's not going to be a 2019 J.K. Dobbins year. It's not going to be a 2,000-yard. Just the way things played out this year, obviously, yes, because of injuries, and we need to see what a fully healthy TreveYon looks like. But I just think they liked it, and I think maybe it's more about Mayan than it's about TreveYon. I think they liked what Mayan did. And I don't think they are going to reduce Mayan's role back to a world that would allow TreveYon to run for 2,000 yards, Stephen, which is where I am right now. And again, that is not a lack of belief in TreveYon-Henderson. It is me trying to react to the way they used Mayan Williams, and I think the way they see those 2 guys operating as a pair. And then also, I don't know where Evan Pryor fits in right now, because a year ago at this time, we sure were jacked up about Evan Pryor's potential.
I think I'd feel that exact same way even if TreveYon-Henderson hadn't been hurt for most of last year. I think if Mayan Williams had been healthy, I think it had just been those 2. I think some of that's how they preached this to Trey when he was in high school. It's not, I don't want to call it a 2-back system, but it is kind of like a 2-back system where 2 guys carry the load. What JK did when he got the ball 300 times, and like even in that spring, I had asked him flat out, if they gave you the ball 300 times, do you think you can handle it? 300, like we talk about 2,000 yards, 300 carries for anybody is a lot of carries over a 14-game season is what they ended up having that year. And some of these backs, even these higher-rated ones, see the bigger picture. It's why Georgia can keep stacking 5-star running back on 5-star running back, and Bama the same way. They don't want – I don't know if – I mean, they take it, obviously, if you give them the ball 300 times. But in bigger picture, it's probably not in TreveYon-Henderson's best interest to have a year where he has the ball 300 times. From a health standpoint, for the longevity of his career, it's better off him being in a situation like this where it is 2 guys who just kind of carry the load, and they – more importantly, they buy into it in a way that JK wasn't buying into it. So, yeah, even if they were healthy, I might feel that way that – neither of these guys are going to get it 300 times. They both might get it 150. And 2,000 yards is just going to be because this dude was averaging 8 yards a carry, which is probably not going to happen. But I agree with it. I think TreveYon probably starts most of the games, but both of them by the end of the season have starter-level snaps and starter-level production. Well, in terms of, like, usage.
Georgia is very instructive and interesting in this because Georgia, it's not a 2-back system at Georgia. It's a 3-back system that they use Kenny McIntosh and Dejon Edwards and Kendall Milton. Kendall Milton had 85 carries for Georgia this year. 85 carries in 15 games. That's like not that much. And then you looked up in the playoff and it's like, oh, it's the 6th series in a playoff game and Kendall Milton's getting the ball. And it's like, no, I mean, but they believed in Kendall Milton just as much as they believed in the other 2 guys. They just divided it up that way. So Nathan, it still feels like sometimes the way Tony Alford talks about it is like, hey, man, if we got a workhorse, we'll ride the workhorse. But the idea that not only could it be treveyon Henderson, Mayan Williams, could it be treveyon Henderson, Mayan Williams, Evan Pryor, or treveyon Henderson, Mayan Williams, Dallin Hayden? Or, hey, guess what? It's the 6th series, and Ohio State and Penn State are tied 21-21 in the middle of the 3rd quarter, and Xavier Johnson's getting this series at running back. I don't know, Nathan. I don't know if the way things accidentally happened in 2022, or you just look at other teams, you look at the way Georgia does it, or you just evaluate the guys you have, and it's like, hey, as good as Treveyon is, he's not Bijan Robinson, he's not a tank. I don't know. I think I'm very curious to see where they arrive. And again, every conversation we have in this context is a fully healthy conversation, and then you never have a fully healthy season. But I almost wonder if they might just plan on 3 dudes, even if they're fully healthy.
Maybe. I think they've always been open to the concept of playing, I think, multiple guys as long as they deserve to play. One of the reasons why J.K. Dobbins had to carry the ball 300 times was because you had Master Teague behind him, who was fine. He was a good backup, and then they didn't feel like they had another person. There was nobody pushing to be a co-starter or to be the 1B in that scenario. And Ohio State will have that. They'll have at least that with Henderson and Williams. And as we said, it may go deeper than that. I asked Kirby Smart about what they did with running backs, and this is what he said. It's really about health and necessity. Throughout our conference, we've done studies, and very few backs have made it through the entire year with a large burden. They tend to get injured. We try to build it where 3 or 4 backs can contribute and play, and some of that's dictated by whether we have leads in the 4th quarter or whether guys are injured. But we don't want to get into this part of the season and not have depth. And I thought it was interesting that he said we've done studies. It isn't just like a feel thing. They see a strategic, the math has to add up, and this is what adds up for them. And let's remember, you bring up J.K. Dobbins. Well, J.K. Dobbins was a little bit banged up in the biggest game of the year. Now, that may have been a fluke thing. Maybe it isn't a thing that was the wear and tear added up. Maybe it just happened in the Clemson game in 2019. But he was hobbling around when they needed him the most in 2019, and maybe having a second guy of similar caliber, maybe a level down, because it's hard to get someone of caliber of J.K. Dobbins. But you know what I'm saying? A second guy might have helped there. So I think we've had these debate on the pod before about, because sort of what J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber went through in 2018 and some of the things we saw in 2020, does multiple backs work or not? And I think having 3 running backs who are starter caliber and playing them all, I don't necessarily see the downside of that. I think that tends to be a bigger problem for some specific running backs than it is as a general approach.
So I just mapped it out. They could do it. They could have a 3-back system and throw the ball as much as they do. So 75 plays, that's on average what they run. I said 30 throws. That gets everybody their touches and whatnot in the off. So now you're down to 45 plays. 15 for Trey, 15 for Mayan, and then 10 for whether it's Evan Pryor, Dallin Hayden, or Chip Trainum, or I don't know, whoever. I don't know. Maybe TC Caffey ends up being the 3rd guy for all we know. But there's your 3 guys. And then you got 5 plays left over that I just said random, which can be an extra throw. It can be a jet sweep to Emeka Ibuka, some bubble screens, because we all know they love those as well, a QB run, whatever it is. But there's your 75 plays where you've got 3 backs who are legitimately involved while you're also having an offense that likes to chuck it.
I want to throw it more than 30 times, but I get what you're saying. So
I do too.
I do think it's well, that's a future pod too. What did the Georgia game tell you? So I do. CJ only threw it 34 times in the Georgia game. I thought in the end, after watching Georgia and preparing like for a month for Georgia, I thought Kenny McIntosh was their second best skill guy behind Brock Bowers. And then there were times where like I'd be like, is Kenny McIntosh hurt? So he's their starting running back. I'd be like, is he hurt? Why isn't he in the game? I haven't seen him for a while. And it's like, oh, that's just kind of what they do. He averaged 13 touches a game. I think he carried it 150 times. He caught 43 passes in 15 games. The second best guy, Nathan. I thought Kenny McIntosh was excellent.
Yeah.
But it's just what they do. And I am unaccustomed to it enough that there'd be times where it's like, oh, okay, here we go. It's Kenny McIntosh times. And it'd be like, oh, Edwards is in the game. And like I said, oh, here comes the Kendall Milton series. And I'd be like, what happened to this guy? And it's just what they do. And I think Kenny McIntosh might be a stud in the NFL. So it doesn't mean that Ryan Day is going to be like, oh, we lost to Georgia. Let's do everything they do. But I don't know. And I know that Steven, like ever since they were recruited, the idea of that two-back thing, that they were told that and everything. But it's still, I was like, I don't know. I think Treveyon might be a Heisman candidate. And Nathan, I don't know.
He still might, though.
I think maybe
because Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards both get the ball at Michigan, but if either one,
but Michigan runs it so much.
Yeah,
Michigan runs it like 65% of the time in a way that Ohio State's never going to do.
Well, and even that example you're giving Kenny McIntosh, like 43 receptions or whatever you said it was, like that's way above what Ohio State was doing with its running backs last season, especially, and even going back to 21 when they were throwing it to Henderson a little bit more. So is that something they would look at, like getting him more involved as a receiver, or any of their running backs more involved as a receiver? I don't know. They obviously like what they have going vertically on every given play, maybe a little bit more than what Georgia does in general, although the Georgia's got good receivers too. So I don't see the downside of it, as long as, like I said before, I think if you were to go back to 2018, I've made this argument before, like one of the reasons why that didn't work is because it didn't work for J.K. Dobbins, not just because it didn't work for any two running backs or any three running backs, because Georgia was already proving that with some of the guys they had, the years that they had, like Nick Chubb and the other guys that they had,
Sony Michel,
yeah. So like they were,
Todd Gurley,
they were putting like multiple NFL running backs in the same backfield and letting them all eat a little bit. You don't get to gorge yourself, but you all get to have a nice meal. And over the course of the year, you've had enough nutrients. So could Ohio State do something like that? I think so. But I also think that it comes down to the evaluations that they're doing of a guy like Evan Pryor and of a guy like Dallin Hayden. I believe they look at treveyon-Henderson and Mayan Williams, and not that they perform at A+ level on every snap, but that they are complete backs. They can do everything that needs to be done in the offense. They can block enough. They run the ball well enough. They can catch the ball. Are all those other guys completely well-rounded? And we may not see Evan Pryor this spring too. He's just coming off of an ACL injury that happened in the preseason last year. So how much he gets to participate this spring is yet to be seen. But how much are those guys? Because that's the kind of the telltale thing for Ohio State. They don't want specialized guys in that backfield. They want guys who can do everything that needs to be done, because that's what keeps your offense versatile and unpredictable.
That's gonna be interesting in itself. Like how many of the running backs are healthy this spring? Because even Treveyon, he's not in that little peg leg thing anymore.
Right.
He's in a normal boot. But like we were talking on the sideline before the Georgia game, and he was not 100%, locked into the idea that he's going to be a completely participant this spring when they get into football. Because he'd had a surgery and he had just got out the boot, which that little peg leg thing is funny to watch a guy walk around in that thing. But if he's in a boot right now, they're doing winter workouts. Is a month and a half from now, is he going to be full go to participate in this spring, or should we just expect to see him, especially for a guy who's also played enough that we get it? Like, I don't know if they need to have him be all in, all out with that in the spring. So maybe we don't see the full Treveyon-Henderson until the fall anyway.
And it's one of those things. Clearly, obviously, the run game, the running back position was a problem for Ohio State in 2022 because of the injuries. When you have your number 3 guy out before the season starts, and then your number 1 and number 2 guys are battling injuries for much of the year, it creates a weakness, which then creates a strength. The idea that Dallin Hayden, that we know anything about Dallin Hayden, we shouldn't know anything about him. It'd be like, who's the guy? Who's the other scholarship guy? The true, but it's like, oh, you mean Dallin Hayden, who ran for 100 yards against Maryland? That Dallin Hayden? It's like, yeah, okay. Well, he might be 4th or 5th on the pecking order, depending what you think of treveyon-henderson, Mayan Williams, Evan Pryor, and Xavier Johnson. And I can't imagine that Chip Trayanum stays a running back. I think he has to go back to linebacker. Not that there's a ton of opportunity at linebacker either, but what are you? What? Like, how could he stay at running back? So,
but actually, you bring up a good point as to another reason why they should try to maybe diversify at running back and get a third guy involved. Is they got to keep this room together a little bit, because Henderson and Williams are gone after this year. And it goes back to the quarterback thing we were talking about before. Somebody else leaves right now because they see absolutely no role. And now you've got one less guy for when it gets turned over to what is now, again, maybe a very thin room for 2024.
Yeah, we think treveyon-henderson's gone. Najee Harris was like the highest rated running back Alabama ever had. He stayed for a 4th year, and then he won the Doak Walker Award. So I don't know. I'm not like, I just wouldn't put it past Trey at this point to go, and I would like another year at this.
And I will say, on top of going back again to a discussion we already had on this pod, we bring it full circle here on Buckeye Talk quite often. He is doing very well in NIL in things that aren't endorsements and sponsorships. He's got a nice real estate portfolio that he's put together and that he's making income off of, that things like that are now allowable under NIL. So again, for someone like him, who in a previous generation, not even generation, 10 years ago, would have just the background he comes from, family need, might have had to go get that paycheck. That may not be the situation he's in if he feels like that extra year could help.
What does real estate portfolio mean? Does he own property?
Him and G. Scott own a house, and I think it's in the.
Wouldn't that be fun? Let's move into it. Do they live in the house?
No.
Do they rent the house out?
They're flipping them. They just flip
or sell them. Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah.
How much? Come on. Will you guys do it for a year? The 3 of us live in Treveyon and G. Scott's flipped house. Have him over.
Can my wife and the baby come live in the house too? You guys want to change some diapers?
Sorry.
Okay.
Your wife would be fun. She's like, get rid of that guy. Oh, no. We'll live with the baby. Because whenever, like a sitcom needs a little boost, you bring in a baby. So we'll bring in a baby.
3 men and a baby.
And conveniently, you already have one. Yeah.
It's true.
Actually, your wife would probably be totally for that. I'm taking the baby. I'm moving in with Steven and Doug. You can see the baby whenever you want, but Steven and Doug will change all the diapers. So, all right. Coming next on Buckeye Talk, we got to talk to our bosses about it. They're pretty good about this stuff. I feel like that's a rubber stamp. Can we move into Treveyon and Henderson and G. Scott's house? Yes, of course you can. And we'll be broadcasting from there, I would imagine, by February.
Listen, if you haven't subscribed to the text yet, becoming a text subscriber and adding your $3.99 a month to the kitty makes this just a little bit more possible that we could do this experiment. 614-350-315.
We'll put in maintenance requests like every Monday, and it's really not a maintenance request. We just want to talk to them about what happened on Saturday.
No, right, yeah. And then Treveyon, it's like, Jerry will bring in treveyon-henderson for interviews on Tuesday. And we'll be like, Doug Maurice of cleveland.com. Treveyon, the second floor toilet won't stop running. What are you going to do about it? But also, we could, for our tech subscribers, we could have a live video feed that would be like real world Buckeye Talk. That you could constantly, if you're a tech subscriber,
Big Brother?
You could click on the link. Big Brother, like constant, watch us constantly on the feed in the house that treveyon-henderson and G. Scott Jr. own. Okay. I'm glad we hashed it. One of my favorite things is hashing out ideas. On the podcast, we're moving into a house owned by college football players.